In this country, the law is written by rich men, son. You're just a pawn. Take the money and walk away while you still can. That's what Senator Gerald Thackeray told me, sliding a briefcase of cash across a white tablecloth. On the morning of the trial, I walked into that courtroom beside the Attorney General of the United States, and he finally understood exactly who he'd been threatening. Hoppa. My name is Harvey Wren. I was 29 years old, an assistant district attorney barely 2 years into the job. And this is the story of the case Senator Thackeray was absolutely certain I'd never have the nerve to actually try. I want to tell you something about myself before I go any further because it matters enormously for everything that comes after. My mother is Justice Catherine Wren, appointed to the Supreme Court 14 years ago, a woman journalists have called the Sword of Justice so often over her career that the nickname has become almost a permanent part of her public identity. I grew up almost entirely outside the public eye myself, my mother fiercely protective of what little private life our family managed to keep, insisting, throughout my entire childhood, that I build whatever career I eventually chose entirely on my own merits rather than her name. I remember a specific conversation from my last year of law school, my mother sitting across our kitchen table, telling me plainly that she'd support whatever path I chose, but that she never once used her position to smooth it for me, understanding, from her own considerable experience, exactly how much that kind of advantage costs a person's actual sense of their own capability over the course of an entire career. I resented that principle slightly at 25, wanting occasionally for things to simply be easier. I understand it considerably better now, at 29, having actually tested my own capability against something that mattered. I took a job as an assistant district attorney straight out of law school, deliberately choosing a modest county office rather than any of the considerably more prestigious clerkships my mother's name could have opened for me, wanting, more than almost anything, to know whether I could actually try a courtroom case on the strength of my own preparation alone. My colleagues in that office knew me simply as Harvey Wren, a name that, given my mother's public prominence under the same surname, occasionally drew a curious second glance, though I'd learned early on to deflect those questions with a vague, polite non-answer that most people accepted without pushing further. I wasn't hiding my identity exactly, I was simply declining to volunteer it, the same careful distinction I'd maintained my entire adult life. The case landed on my desk 11 months into the job. A hit and run that had left a young mother named Rosa Delgado with permanent injuries after Tyler Thackeray, 23 years old, son of Senator Gerald Thackeray, 23 years old, son of Senator Gerald Thackeray, drove through a crosswalk at considerable speed, struck her, and fled the scene entirely. I remember reviewing the initial incident report for the first time. The specific clinical detail of Rosa's injuries laid out in careful medical language had still managed to convey, underneath the professional distance, exactly how close that intersection had come to becoming something considerably worse than an injury case. She'd been walking home from her night shift, 7 months pregnant at the time, and the injuries she'd sustained had ultimately required an emergency delivery weeks earlier than planned. Though I'm relieved to tell you her daughter arrived healthy despite everything. Witnesses had identified Tyler's vehicle within hours. Traffic camera footage confirmed it definitively. It was, by any ordinary measure, a straightforward case, exactly the kind of clear liability that should have moved through the system without the particular resistance it eventually encountered. I understood from the moment Senator Thackeray's name appeared in the file that this particular case was not going to unfold like an ordinary one. Senator Thackeray had spent 18 years building a political career on a carefully cultivated reputation for family values and tough-on-crime rhetoric. A reputation his son's hit and run threatened to unravel entirely if it ever reached trial with the kind of scrutiny a senator's son's case naturally attracts. I'd followed his career distantly, the way most people follow a prominent senator's career, aware of his considerable influence within the state party and his reputation among colleagues who had dealt with his office before for a specific brand of transactional politics that rewarded loyalty and punished inconvenience with equal, practiced efficiency. The pressure started within a week. Thackeray retained Bramwell and Klein, a law firm with a considerable reputation for aggressive, well-resourced defense on behalf of wealthy clients, and the pattern of interference that followed was, I understand now, one they'd clearly executed before with practiced efficiency. 2 of my 3 key witnesses withdrew their statements within the first month, citing, vaguely, that they'd reconsidered what they'd actually seen. I later learned, through careful follow-up conversations neither witness would confirm on the record, that both had received unexpected, considerable sums of money around the same time their memories had grown suddenly uncertain. I remember sitting across from one of those witnesses, a delivery driver who'd given a detailed, confident statement the very night of the accident, watching him avoid my eyes entirely as he explained that he must have been mistaken about the vehicle color, in a tone that convinced neither of us, though he clearly had no intention of correcting it on the record, regardless of how unconvincing it sounded. My third witness, an elderly man named Mr. Okafor, who'd watched the entire incident from his own front porch, received a visit from two men who never identified themselves, who told him, plainly, that continuing to cooperate with the prosecution might not be good for his health at his age. He called me the following morning, his voice shaking, and told me he still intended to testify, though I could hear, clearly, exactly how much that decision was costing him. I drove to his house myself that same afternoon, sitting with him on the same porch where he'd witnessed the accident. Listening to him describe the two men's visit in careful detail, understanding, watching him, exactly the specific kind of courage it took for a 78-year-old man to maintain his testimony after being told, plainly, that his safety might depend on abandoning it. I told him I'd arrange for additional patrol presence near his home, though I understood, even offering it, how limited that particular protection actually was against the kind of resources Thackeray's family could apply if they decided to escalate further. Senator Thackeray requested a private dinner meeting roughly 6 weeks into the case at a five-star restaurant downtown, a setting I understood immediately was chosen deliberately, meant to communicate exactly the kind of resources and comfort he assumed would eventually persuade me. I remember arriving at that restaurant considerably more nervous than I let myself outwardly show, understanding that whatever happened at that table would likely determine the entire trajectory of the case going forward. The host led me to a private corner booth, already set with a level of formality that made clear this dinner had been planned as a performance as much as a conversation. He arrived with two attorneys from Bramwell and Klein, though he sent them to a separate table once I arrived, apparently preferring to deliver whatever he intended to say without witnesses present who later corroborated. I appreciate you meeting with me, Harvey, he said, using my first name with a familiarity I hadn't extended him. I think we can resolve this like reasonable men without dragging either of our families through something considerably uglier than either of us actually wants. I told him I was there to listen, though I already understood clearly exactly what kind of resolution he intended to propose. He ordered wine for both of us without asking. Another small, deliberate assertion of control over a room he clearly expected to fully command. He slid a briefcase across the white tablecloth between us, opening it just enough for me to see the considerable stack of cash inside. In this country, the law is written by rich men, son, he told me. You're just a pawn. Take the money and walk away while you still can. I looked at that briefcase for a long moment, understanding with total clarity exactly what accepting it would mean and exactly what refusing it was likely to cost me. Senator, I said, I'm going to decline that, and I'm going to ask you to close it before anyone at a nearby table happens to glance over. His expression shifted. The specific, controlled irritation of a man unaccustomed to having an offer like that refused outright. I don't think you understand your position clearly enough yet, he said. I have considerable influence over your office's budget, over your supervisor's career, over whether you ever try a meaningful case again in this state after this one. Drop this prosecution, or I promise you your career ends considerably sooner than mine ever will. He leaned forward slightly as he said it, his voice dropping into a register I recognized instantly as the specific tone powerful people use when they want a threat to feel personal, rather than merely professional. I can also make certain the wrong kind of evidence turns up connected to your own name, Harvey, if it comes to that. I genuinely prefer it didn't. I told him as evenly as I can manage that I intended to continue preparing the case for trial exactly as the evidence required, and that I appreciated him being direct about his intentions, since it would make my own decisions considerably easier going forward. I left that dinner without touching the briefcase, without raising my voice, and without giving him the satisfaction of watching me appear even slightly rattled. Though I want to be honest that the walk to my car afterward required considerably more composure than it probably looked like from the outside. I sat in my car for nearly 15 minutes before I trusted myself to actually drive, replaying his specific phrasing about evidence turning up connected to my own name, understanding exactly how serious a threat that particular sentence actually represented, coming from a man with his level of institutional reach. I want to tell you about the specific moment that changed everything, because it's the hinge this whole story turns on, though it didn't actually involve any decision I made directly. What I didn't know sitting at that dinner was that my mother's security detail, Standard protective protocol extended discreetly to immediate family of a sitting Supreme Court justice had flagged unusual activity connected to my case weeks earlier. Once Senator Thackeray's staff began making inquiries about my background through channels considerably more thorough than ordinary due diligence. I learned considerably later exactly how that protocol actually worked. A low-profile monitoring arrangement, rarely activated beyond passive background awareness, that exists quietly around the immediate families of sitting justices, specifically because of the unique security considerations their position creates. I'd known abstractly that some version of that protection existed. I'd never once imagined it might actually become relevant to my own ordinary professional life. I want to be clear about something I think matters enormously. I never once asked for that protection to be activated on my behalf. I never mentioned my mother's position to anyone connected to this case, never leveraged it, never even considered it as an option, precisely because I'd spent my entire adult life deliberately avoiding exactly that kind of advantage. My mother found out about the specific threats against me and against my witnesses through a routine incident report her detail filed as a matter of standard protocol, roughly 2 weeks before the trial date. I found out, considerably later, that she'd made a single phone call after reading that report. To the Attorney General personally, someone she'd known professionally for over a decade. I want to describe that phone call between us as honestly as I can, because I think the specific texture of it matters more than the dramatic outcome that eventually followed. My mother rarely called simply to check in during ordinary weeks, both of us having settled over years into a relationship built more on quiet mutual respect than frequent conversation. Hearing her voice that particular evening, I understood immediately, before she'd said more than a few words, that something considerably more serious than an ordinary catch-up call had prompted it. She called me that same evening, the first time in months we'd spoken about anything beyond ordinary family matters. "Harvey," she said, "I need you to understand that I'm not doing this to take the case away from you. I'm doing this because a sitting United States senator threatened to destroy your career and potentially frame you criminally rather than let a legitimate prosecution proceed. That crosses a line I'm not willing to simply monitor from a distance." I told her I understood completely, and that I appreciated her telling me directly, rather than simply acting without my knowledge. I wanted to be honest that I didn't fully understand, in that phone call, exactly how far things had already moved. I assumed going into the following 2 weeks of trial preparation that whatever my mother had set in motion would unfold through some ordinary, if elevated, channel of federal oversight, quietly monitoring the case from a distance. I didn't learn the actual details until the morning of the trial itself, when a black federal vehicle arrived in my apartment considerably earlier than I'd expected, and I found the Attorney General of the United States, Diane Alcaraz, waiting for me personally, along with a folder considerably thicker than I'd anticipated. "Mr. Wren," she said, "I believe you and I are walking into that courtroom together this morning." I remember standing in my own doorway for a long moment, still holding a cup of coffee I'd made only minutes earlier, understanding that whatever version of that morning I'd mentally prepared for over the preceding 2 weeks had just been entirely replaced by something considerably larger. She walked me through the folder's contents in the car on the way to the courthouse, briefly but thoroughly, and I remember feeling, reading through it, a specific mixture of relief and genuine shock at exactly how much had been quietly assembled without my knowledge. She explained as we drove that her office had spent the preceding 2 weeks corroborating the surveillance material independently, unwilling to bring anything before a federal court that wasn't airtight enough to survive whatever considerable legal resistance Bromwell and Klein would inevitably mount. "Your mother didn't ask me to move quickly," she told me. "She asked me to move correctly. I want you to understand the distinction, because it matters for how this case actually gets tried today." I asked her, somewhat hesitantly, whether she'd had any reservations about the personal nature of the request, coming from a sitting justice about her own son's case. She was quiet for a moment before answering. "Your mother has spent 14 years on that bench, never once asking me for a personal favor," she said. "When she finally did, it wasn't a favor. It was a report of a federal crime in progress, which happened to involve her son. I'd have opened this investigation regardless of whose child was sitting in that prosecutor's chair." I want to describe the specific walk into that courthouse because I think it matters. Attorney General Alcaraz walked beside me the entire distance from the car to the courtroom doors, a considerable security detail surrounding us both, cameras from local press already gathering, having clearly received word that something considerably larger than an ordinary hit-and-run trial was unfolding that morning. I remember the specific quality of that walk, the two of us moving through a crowd of reporters shouting questions neither of us answered. The considerable weight of the folder she'd handed me now tucked under my own arm, understanding that I was about to walk into a courtroom carrying evidence that would end the powerful man's career, gathered entirely without my knowledge or direct involvement. I saw Senator Thackeray at his legal team near the defense table as we entered, and I watched, with considerable satisfaction, the exact moment his confident expression collapsed into something closer to genuine alarm, recognizing Alcaraz's face instantly, understanding, before either of us said a single word, exactly how catastrophically his assumptions about that morning had just been proven wrong. "Halsell?" Thackeray's lead attorney said, standing quickly. "I wasn't informed the Department of Justice had any involvement in these proceedings." "You're being informed now," Attorney General Alcaraz said, her voice carrying clearly across a courtroom that had gone almost completely silent. "The department has opened a federal investigation into witness tampering, bribery of a public official, and obstruction of justice connected to this case, based on evidence gathered over the preceding several weeks." I watched Senator Thackeray's face drain of color entirely, understanding in that exact moment exactly how thoroughly his own carelessness at that five-star dinner had been documented. Here's the twist I want to tell you about now, the one that mattered considerably more than the trial itself, and the one I didn't fully understand the scope of until the evidence was formally presented that morning. My mother's security detail hadn't simply recorded that single dinner conversation. Their monitoring, once activated, had traced Bramwell and Klein's activity considerably further back than my own case, uncovering a documented pattern spanning 2 other states where the firm had employed nearly identical tactics on behalf of other wealthy clients: witness payoffs, intimidation, and in one prior case, a remarkably similar bribery attempt against a different young prosecutor who had ultimately taken the money and quietly dropped his own case 4 years earlier. I sat in that courtroom listening to Attorney General Alcaraz lay out the specifics of that pattern, understanding, gradually, exactly how much larger this entire case had actually become while I'd been focused entirely on my own single prosecution. 2 other jurisdictions, 2 other sets of witnesses who'd been paid or intimidated into silence, 2 other cases where the truth had simply, quietly disappeared, the way Thackeray had clearly expected mine to disappear as well. Attorney General Alcaraz presented that pattern formally to the court, establishing not simply a single incident of witness tampering, but a documented, multi-state conspiracy that transformed the case from a straightforward hit-and-run prosecution into something considerably larger, implicating Bramwell and Klein's senior partners directly in a pattern of obstructions spanning years. I watched the defense table's composure fully collapse as that pattern was laid out, Thackeray's lead attorney whispering urgently with his colleagues, understanding in real time that whatever careful legal strategy they'd prepared for an ordinary hit-and-run trial had just become entirely irrelevant against evidence of a federal conspiracy case. Senator Thackeray tried, briefly, to interject, standing from his seat despite his own attorney's visible attempt to stop him. "This is a political attack," he said, his voice carrying considerably less authority than it had at that restaurant table weeks earlier. "You have no right, I have every right, Senator," Attorney General Alcaraz said calmly. "You bribed a public official, threatened a witness, and attempted to obstruct a legitimate criminal prosecution. Those are federal crimes regardless of how many elections you've won." Now that Nalan sat, Hal Evans, doubly startled by the morning's unexpected turn but professionally composed throughout, ordered a formal recess to allow the newly presented federal evidence to be properly processed, effectively ending any possibility that the trial would proceed the way Senator Thackeray's team had originally planned. Tyler Thackeray's own case proceeded separately in the weeks that followed, the underlying hit-and-run evidence entirely unaffected by his father's failed interference, resulting, eventually, in a conviction that included considerable prison time, a sentence I understand many observers considered more severe than it might have been, without the additional scrutiny his father's obstruction had drawn to the entire case. Mr. Okafor testified at that trial considerably steadier on the stand than either of us had expected, given the fear he'd carried since those 2 unidentified men visited his porch months earlier. He told me afterward in the hallway outside the courtroom that he decided, somewhere during his testimony, that describing exactly what he'd witnessed mattered more to him than whatever risk had once made his hands shake reading me that morning phone call. I told him I understood exactly how much courage that decision had actually required, and that Rosa Delgado's case existed in its final successful form largely because he'd made it. Senator Thackeray resigned from office within the month, facing his own separate federal charges for bribery of a public official and obstruction of justice, charges that ended a political career he'd spent 18 years carefully building. Bramwell and Klein's senior partners face formal disbarment proceedings in 3 separate states, The multi-state pattern Alcaraz's team had uncovered, giving state bar associations more than sufficient grounds to act decisively. I followed Thackeray's own federal case to its conclusion nearly 2 years later, a plea agreement that included a considerable prison sentence and a permanent ban from ever seeking public office again. I didn't attend that sentencing personally. I understood by then that whatever satisfaction the case still owed me had already arrived. Standing beside Attorney General Alcaraz in that courtroom the morning his own composure first collapsed, I testified before the federal grand jury investigating the broader conspiracy, describing that dinner in careful, specific detail, understanding throughout the process exactly how differently this entire case might have concluded if my mother's protective detail hadn't happened to flag Thackeray's background inquiries weeks before I ever sat down at that white tablecloth. I remember returning to my office the week after the trial, colleagues who'd known me for 2 years as simply Harvey Wren, competent but unremarkable junior prosecutor, now looking at me with a specific, recalibrated curiosity I found genuinely uncomfortable for longer than I expected. My supervisor, a considerate man named District Attorney Frank Ilunga, who'd assigned me the case without any particular expectation it would become what it did, called me into his office to ask, plainly, whether I intended to stay with the county office or move on to something considerably more prominent now that my background had become public knowledge. I told him I intended to stay, at least for now, understanding that the entire reason I'd chosen that office in the first place, to prove something to myself about my own capability independent of my mother's name, still mattered to me regardless of how publicly that name had now become attached to my work. He seemed genuinely pleased by that answer, telling me the office could use considerably more prosecutors willing to try a case exactly the way I had, resources or no resources behind them. I want to tell you what happened to Rosa Delgado, the woman Tyler Thackeray struck and left in that crosswalk, because I think her story matters more than any of the political theater that eventually surrounded it. She received a civil settlement, considerably larger than initially offered, once the full scope of the family's obstruction became public and Thackeray's remaining legal resources shifted almost entirely toward his own mounting defense. I visited her twice during her recovery, watching her slowly regain mobility that doctors had initially told her might never fully return. I remember the first of those visits particularly clearly, Rosa sitting in a hospital rehabilitation room with her newborn daughter asleep in a bassinet beside her, thanking me repeatedly for continuing the case despite what she'd already heard, through hospital gossip and local news coverage, about the pressure being applied to make it quietly disappear. I told her the thanks belonged considerably more to my mother's security detail than to any particular courage on my own part, though she waved that distinction away, telling me, plainly, that refusing the money still counted for something regardless of what protection eventually backed it up. I almost gave up hope this would ever actually matter, she told me. During one of those visits, I watched the news, watched their lawyers, and honestly expected the whole thing to just quietly disappear the way I'd heard these cases usually do. I told her I understood exactly why she'd expected that, and that I was genuinely sorry it had taken the specific, unusual circumstances of my own background to prevent it from happening that way this time. I still visit Rosa occasionally, watching her daughter grow, considerably more mobile herself now than doctors had once predicted, though she still walks with a slight permanent limp that serves, I think, as its own quiet, ongoing reminder of exactly how close that entire case came to disappearing the way Thackeray's family clearly expected it to. I met with my mother for dinner about a month after the trial concluded, the first real conversation we'd had about any of it beyond that initial phone call. I asked her directly whether she regretted involving the Attorney General, given how publicly it had ultimately connected our family names together after decades of careful separation. We sat at her own kitchen table, the same table where she'd once told me at 25 that she'd never use her position to smooth my path, and I found the specific symmetry of that setting almost impossible not to comment on directly. She smiled, briefly, when I mentioned it, telling me she'd thought about that same conversation more than once over the preceding month herself. She considered the question for a long moment before answering. I spent my entire career believing the law should protect people regardless of power or money, she told me. I wasn't going to watch a sitting senator prove that belief wrong specifically because the target happened to be my own son. I'd made the same call for any young prosecutor facing exactly what you faced. The fact that it was you simply meant I found out about it faster. I asked her a little hesitantly whether this meant her earlier principle about never smoothing my path had simply been suspended once the stakes became serious enough. She shook her head slowly. I didn't smooth your path, Harvey. I made sure the path itself wasn't illegally blocked by a man with more money than either of us. There's a difference. And I think you already understand it, or you wouldn't have refused that briefcase in the first place. Ah, I understood. Hearing that, exactly why she'd spent an entire career earning the nickname the press had given her, and exactly how much that specific, unwavering consistency had cost her personally, in ways I'd never fully appreciated until I found myself on the receiving end of it directly. I think about that whole case often, and what it actually taught me. Not that justice always arrives, because I understand with total clarity exactly how many prosecutors before me had faced some version of Senator Thackeray's playbook and simply taken the money, understandably, given the very real threat to their own careers and safety. What it taught me was something quieter than that. My refusal alone wouldn't have been enough to end Thackeray's career. It took my mother's institutional protection, activated without my knowledge or request, to actually give that refusal the teeth it needed to matter. I think, too, about the previous prosecutor 4 years earlier who'd taken Bromwell and Klein's money and quietly dropped his own case. I don't know his name. I'd chosen not to look for it, understanding that whatever specific pressure he faced probably resembled mine considerably more closely than any comfortable moral distance would suggest. I don't know what I would have done in his exact circumstances facing that same threat without my particular unusual set of resources quietly working in the background. I think about him specifically because I don't want this story understood as a simple morality tale about courage triumphing over corruption through sheer force of will. My courage mattered. I want to be honest that it also wasn't sufficient on its own, and I think it would be dishonest of me to let the dramatic shape of this story's ending obscure that particular truth. Most prosecutors facing Thackeray's specific playbook don't have a Supreme Court justice quietly watching their case from a discreet, protective distance. I understand exactly how fortunate that particular circumstance made me, and I try not to mistake it for something I earned entirely on my own. Af, if you've ever been told, by someone with more power than you, that the rules simply don't apply to people like them, I understand that particular threat better than most people ever will. I don't have a universal formula for answering it. I only know that refusing to fold, even without any guarantee of protection, is worth considerably more than most people in that moment believe it is, and that sometimes the exact right people are watching considerably more closely than you realize. Hack, thank you for listening to my story tonight. If it reminded you of a moment someone with power tried to convince you the rules didn't actually apply to them, I'd love to hear about it. I hope your own version of that refusal gets exactly the backup it deserves, whether or not you ever know it's coming. And if you want more stories like this one, stick around. There's always another one waiting. Take care of each other out there. Good night, everyone.